This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the best all-in-one visual website builder. During the 4th century CE, the Roman Empire was in a deep crisis. Both politically and militarily, the empire was unstable and had gone through a tumultuous period of barbarian invasions and disastrous civil wars. The tumultuous years after the death of Constantine the Great saw his sons Constans and Constantius II emerge as emperors of the Western and Eastern Roman Empire. But after years of political turmoil, Constantius II remained the sole surviving son of the great emperor, when his brother Constans was overthrown by the commander of an elite unit of his legions, Flavius Magnentius. Constantius reacted almost immediately. After concluding a truce with the Persians, he consolidated his forces and marched against the usurper and his brother's murderer. He eventually faced Magnentius in Pannonia in the disastrous Battle of Mursa that saw massive casualties for both sides, but proved to be a Pyrrhic victory for Constantius. After a second and final battle in southern France, the Battle of Mons Seleucus, Magnentius was finally crushed, and Constantius remained the sole and undisputed ruler of the empire. The disastrous civil war that lasted for 3 years stripped the empire of thousands of irreplaceable legionnaires and left many regions virtually undefended. It was during this period that various Germanic tribes took advantage of the defensive gaps and began a series of attacks and raids along the Rhine frontier. It should be noted that there are some passing references in our sources which indicate that some Germanic tribes may have been invited by Constantius in order to hinder Magnentius during their civil war, but this fact cannot be determined with certainty. Nevertheless, large Germanic bands were now roaming freely across Gaul. The victorious Constantius appointed Silvanus, a Frankish-born general, as Magister Militum of Gaul, with 13,000 troops under his command, and with the main portion of the army, Constantius marched against the Alemanni and succeeded in driving them out of the region of Raetia, before binding them with a treaty of alliance. But while he was successful in restoring the situation throughout the ravaged Gallic countryside, Silvanus too became embroiled in court intrigue, declaring himself emperor in 355. However, his rebellion against Constantius didn't last long, as Silvanus was murdered by his own men only 28 days later. His death created another leadership vacuum, and it wasn't long before Germanic raiding bands renewed their attacks on Gaul. With the frontier in tatters, the barbarians, driven by a ferocious leader named Nodomar, were able to raid a large number of cities, enslave 20,000 Roman citizens, and capture nearly all frontier fortresses along the Rhine. With the situation critical, the overly suspicious, borderline paranoid Constantius needed a right-hand man that he could trust, so his attention turned to his immediate family members. His choices were limited, however, due to the diligence with which he systematically exterminated those close to him. But by a stroke of fortune, the only surviving relative of Constantius was a young man by the name of Julian. He would become known to history as Julian the Philosopher, or as his enemies called him, Julian the Apostate. At 23 years of age, Julian was stationed in Athens and had a reputation for being a bookworm, and up until that point he spent most of his life studying philosophy and history. By immersing himself into the classics, he gradually moved away from Christianity and had secretly adopted the religion and outlook of his classical heroes of Greco-Roman antiquity. It was this complex and unique young man that accompanied Constantius to Mediolanum. The emperor appointed him as his Caesar, thinking that without any experience in military affairs, Julian would be easy to control, and dispatched him to winter in southern Gaul. This was to be the beginning of one of the most brilliant campaigns in history. Julian spent the winter of 355 to 356 in Vienna, preparing himself for the upcoming campaign, studying the military exploits of famous historical personalities and taking notes. His first task was to link up his army with that of the other high-ranking official in Gaul, Marcellus, who had succeeded Silvanus after his downfall, and who was wintering with his own army in Remi. This movement involved a march through a territory that was swarming with huge Germanic raiding bands, some of them more numerous than Julian's contingent. Moving rapidly, Julian was able to drive off a large band of barbarians who were besieging the city of Augustodunum. When he finally reached Reims, he consulted with his officers and decided, despite the advice of his generals, to follow a decisive course of action and march straight at the source of the problem in order to recapture the area of what is today Alsace. On his way to Brotomagus, Julian was ambushed by a large Germanic force. The Germans, using their superior knowledge of the topography and the dense mist of that day, attacked a couple of Julian's rear guard legions and nearly destroyed them. They were ultimately saved by the untimely intervention of nearby elite regiments that heard the shouts and clanging of steel in the distance. When the army was finally approaching Brotomagus, Julian was able to drive off yet another large band of raiders. After a brief assessment of the situation, he set out to recover the city of Cologne. While marching along the Rhine, he faced little to no resistance and eventually recaptured the largely destroyed and abandoned city unopposed. Shortly afterwards, he was able to conclude a peace treaty with the Franks. It was an agreement of great strategic value for the Roman effort, as the treaty pacified a large portion of the Rhine frontier and enabled Julian to focus his efforts and resources against the Alemanni. With Cologne recaptured and a peace treaty with the Franks secured, Julian departed for winter quarters at Agendicum. However, in order to alleviate the supply shortages and distribute the burden, Julian dispersed his troops, sending Marcellus with the largest portion of the army to winter at Dyrrhachium. The Caesar, with his few forces, appeared as an easy target for the marauding Alemanni, and that was enough to entice them to besiege him. For 1 month the Alemanni surrounded and besieged Julian. While he had the opportunity to display his leadership, coordinating the defense and encouraging his troops, the barbarians lacked the necessary expertise to breach the fortified city, and despite their vast numerical superiority, they were eventually forced to retreat. During the siege, Marcellus, even though he had under his command the largest part of the army, failed to come to the aid of Julian. Whether or not his failure to assist the Caesar was due to cowardice or personal animosity against Julian is still unclear. Constantius decided to dismiss him after receiving a letter from Julian that described Marcellus's conduct and replaced him with a new general who was more compatible with Julian, a man called Severus. For the campaigning season of 357, Constantius had formulated an impressive plan, aiming to crush the Germanic raiders once and for all. In a gigantic pincer movement, Julian would advance from Agendicum while at the same time Constantius would dispatch a large army of 25,000 troops from Raetia under the command of General Barbatio. Their objective was to unite near Strasbourg and trap the Alemanni within the pincer, then cut them to pieces. A complicated and ambitious plan that was uniquely large in scale. However, things did not go according to plan, and in a confirmation of the old saying that no plan survives first contact with the enemy, a large unidentified band of Germanic marauders moved between the two Roman armies and advanced against Lugdunum, ravaging and looting the area as they went. But after their attempt to quickly capture Lugdunum failed, the raiders were now trapped and attempted to retreat. Julian immediately dispatched 3 contingents of cavalry southwards to deal with the Germans. But in Barbatio's sector, most of the barbarians managed to escape and reach the Rhine uncontested. It is not entirely clear, but apparently Barbatio hindered Julian's commanders from cutting off the rest of the retreating Germans, either because of personal animosity towards Julian or because he was following Constantius's instructions, who may have wanted to see the Caesar humiliated. From Dura Quartarum, Julian pursued the barbarians vigorously, and in their turn the barbarians blocked the Col de Severn with tree trunks and withdrew on the islets that dotted the river Rhine. Julian, determined to flush out the Germans from their little islands, contemplated his options. Once again, Barbatio was quite unwilling to offer any kind of assistance to the Caesar. With no apparent way to cross the Rhine and reach the islands, Julian sent his general Baenabordes with an elite detachment of lightly armed auxilia to deal with the Germans. The river was fordable at many points due to a summer drought, so the legionnaires, using their shields as rafts to stay afloat, managed to reach one of the islands. The Alemanni were caught totally off guard, and all of them were massacred. The Romans repeated the exact same thing on a few nearby islands, and the Germans eventually evacuated them altogether and retreated to the east bank of the Rhine. Julian now attempted to secure his strategic advantage by setting his legionnaires to rebuild the key fortress of Tre Tabernae, which oversaw and controlled the preferred invasion route of the Alemanni into Gaul. At the same time, Barbatio's force marched northwards along the river Rhine in order to eventually link up with Julian and accomplish the overall strategic objective of the whole campaign. But it was not to be. Either because of his incompetence or because of his unwillingness to collaborate and assist Julian, he never made it. While on his way to Tre Tabernae, his vanguard was ambushed by a large Germanic horde. Barbatio, instead of fighting, retreated in disarray, leaving most of his army's provisions behind, eventually falling all the way back to Raetia. Then, without Julian's permission and in the middle of the campaigning season, Barbatio sent his legions across the Alps into winter quarters in Italy, essentially abandoning the campaign and Julian in the midst of the operations. As Barbatio incredibly wasn't punished for his actions, it is hard to believe that he wasn't acting on Constantius's orders. Whatever the case, with his forces out of the picture, Julian was left with only around 13,000 troops to face the Germanic hordes. Chenodomar, after being informed about the strength of Julian's army, understood that this was an exceptional opportunity to get rid of the Roman forces in Gaul for good. He ordered a mass mobilization of all of his vassal kings, gathering their bands near Argentoratum. A huge Germanic army of about 25,000 to 35,000 men spent 3 days crossing the Rhine, eventually gathering near modern-day Strasbourg. Chenodomar was so confident of his victory that he even sent an ultimatum to Julian, demanding from him to immediately evacuate the area. Julian was now faced with a critical judgment call. He could either retreat to the fortifications of Tre Tabernae and face the horde from a well-defended position, or he could march against the enemy and face them in a decisive pitched battle, in which the Romans traditionally had the upper hand, but they were now massively outnumbered. With his legionnaires clamoring for a fight and his officers advising in favor of a drastic course of action, since the Germans were for once united into a single army, something that offered the prospect of a decisive victory, the young Caesar needed no further persuasion. The exploits of his classical heroes must have been vivid in his mind. Like Julius Caesar before him, he would face his enemies proactively. At dawn, Julian marched his army towards Argentoratum. He finally came in sight of the Germanic army at around midday. The Caesar ordered a general halt, gathered his officers and assessed the situation. His initial order was for his army to encamp and face the enemy the next day when they are properly rested, but his men and officers objected fiercely against this, exhorting Julian to immediately engage the enemy while their morale was high. Julian decided to advance. Around the same time, Chenodomar was alerted by his lookouts and marched his army towards his chosen field of battle, just a few miles away from his base near Argentoratum. Julian arrayed his army in 2 lines. This was a standard formation for the period. His numerical inferiority meant that his infantry had to be widely spaced apart if he wanted to retain the depth of formation. The legions were placed at the center and the elite Auxilia Palatina regiments to his flanks. To his extreme left flank, Julian had positioned Severus with a strong contingent of the army, and to his extreme right he had positioned all of his cavalry, including the elite and heavily armored Cataphractarii units. It was here that he placed his best hope of achieving a quick victory. He positioned himself with his escort of 200 Scalaris horsemen in between the 2 lines, just behind the archers. The Germanic army was lined up in a similar fashion, with the bulk of their infantry at the center of the formation and the entire cavalry positioned at the left flank, opposing their Roman counterpart. Chenodomar understood well the danger that the Roman cavalry posed, so he came up with a cunning stratagem by interspersing lightly armed foot warriors among his cavalrymen. He also had another trick up his sleeve. His right flank was covered by dense woods, and within those woods Chenodomar's nephew, a young man with the Greek name Serapio, commanded a substantial force of warriors, preparing an ambush for the Romans. The battle began when a few warriors to the right side of Chenodomar's formation couldn't resist the temptation of attacking Severus. They broke ranks and eagerly charged, thus giving away their position and probably compromising their own meticulously prepared ambush. Julian, with his escort, moved closer in order to oversee the conduct of his left flank. Severus's troops stood firm and were able to eventually push back the impetuous Germanic warriors. Soon after, the 2 armies marched against each other and threw their javelins, engaging in combat all over the front. It was now that Julian's cavalry charged against Chenodomar's riders. The 3,000-strong Roman horsemen, with their elite Cataphractarii, clashed against a 4,000-strong Germanic tribal cavalryman. The lightly armed infantry that Chenodomar mixed with his cavalry proved to be decisive. Alemannic warriors infiltrated themselves underneath the Roman heavily armored units and stabbed their horses. Those riders who fell were easily dispatched with daggers and knives. Mounting losses and the combined pressure of the Germanic cavalry caused an unexpected and catastrophic general Roman rout. The survivors turned their horses around and fled, eventually clashing with and wreaking havoc to their own right wing. The left flank of the Alemanni, combined with the victorious light-armed warriors, charged the disorganized Roman right wing. The elite Auxilia Palatina managed to slow down the Germanic onslaught for some time, but gaps were beginning to appear in the line of the Roman infantry. The situation was eventually stabilized by the timely intervention from the right flank of Julian's 2nd Reserve Infantry. Julian noticed the severe situation that was developing on his right wing and galloped to its aid, eventually managing to halt the rout of a portion of his cavalry and return it to the fray. Waving his conspicuous standard, a purple dragon, he exclaimed, "Whither are we fleeing, my most valiant men? Do you know not that flight never leads to safety, but shows the folly of a useless effort? Let us return to our companions, to be at least sharers in their coming glory, if it is without consideration that we are abandoning them as they fight for their country." The victorious Germanic cavalry turned and headed towards the other side of the field, in an apparent attempt to combine with the troops of Serapio and create a massive striking force. While the whole battle was hanging in the balance, the Alemanni warriors made their final and decisive push at the center of the Roman formation. A group of chieftains and elite warriors combined and formed a dense triangular mass, furiously charging the Roman shield wall. The Roman first line buckled and gave way, separating at the center and creating a gap through which the Alemanni charged against the second Roman line. The large number of warriors began to pour in through the gap in the center, something that inadvertently caused them to gradually get hemmed inside a crescent of Roman soldiers. And now the elite Praemani legion from the second line of Julian's army marched forward and blocked the advance of the victorious Germans. By forming an impenetrable shield wall, the Romans nullified the Germanic advantage. The barbarians, unable to break through, were now vulnerable on their flanks. Not long after, the Roman general gave the order, and the second line advanced in unison, attacking the enemy from all sides. Meanwhile, on the Roman left wing, Severus was able to drive out and defeat the Germanic warriors that were laying in ambush inside the woods. That was more than the barbarians could handle, and now the tide of battle turned against them. Frustrated by the lack of progress and the mounting losses, hemmed in on both sides, the Alemanni began to individually abandon the battlefield, which turned into an all-out rout. The victorious Julian would not allow his enemy to escape unscathed. He chased down the fleeing Alemanni until they eventually reached the Rhine. Furthermore, he was eventually able to corner down and capture Conodemar himself, who was surrounded and forced to surrender to a Roman cavalry detachment. Around 6,000 Germanic warriors perished on the battlefield, and probably thousands more drowned while trying to swim across the Rhine. In contrast, the Roman casualties were superficial, as they only lost 243 men in total. It was a glorious triumph for Julian, and a unique instance for the Western Roman Empire. It would be one of the last major victories that Rome ever achieved on its western frontier. Flavius Claudius Julianus would continue his campaign against the Germanic tribes for a few more years, making peace treaties and restoring order. After a brief dispute with his cousin Constantius, he would eventually be proclaimed emperor by his soldiers and spark a civil war. Just before the two armies clashed, Constantius would die and declare Julian as his successor. The new emperor will eventually embark on a campaign against the Persians, attempting to emulate his childhood hero, Alexander the Great. This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the best all-in-one visual website builder. Whether you're into creative writing, YouTubing, podcasting, selling merchandise online, look no further than Squarespace. With numerous robust features, Squarespace allows you to build amazing websites with tons of functionality that will wow your visitors every time. One of my favorite features is the integrated analytics, which gives you an insight into how your site is performing. With analytics, you can get a clear picture of what draws the attention of your visitors through visual reports on various statistics. If you want to share your creative content, a story, or a service with the world, click on the link in the description below. By visiting squarespace.com/historymarsh, you will not only be supporting our channel, but you'll get 10% off on your first purchase on Squarespace. Special thanks to our friend Hoc Est Bellum for collaborating with us. He also makes animated battle videos, so make sure to check out and subscribe to his channel. Credit goes to our awesome patrons who make videos like this one possible. Consider joining them to support our work. You can also support us by subscribing to our channel and clicking the bell button to get notified when our new videos are released. And as always, thank you for watching.